Three children and their pregnant mother were found dead inside a car hanging off a cliff edge. But what police found inside their home turned a tragedy into Australia's worst family massacre. You're about to revisit the day that shattered a family and stunned a nation. On July 2nd, 1970, a group of tourists exploring the rugged Australian coastline stumbled upon something strange, something that made them stop in their tracks. A smashed car, abandoned, sat eerily close to the edge of a high cliff, the ocean raging beneath it. One strong breeze and it would have been swallowed by the sea. A horror scene awaited inside the car when three children and a mother were found dead. When police arrived and ran the license plate, it led them to a quiet home in suburban Melbourne, and little did they know, a murder scene awaited them. As news spread, people were left asking, what could drive a father to destroy his own bloodline? Why would he take the lives of his own family and disappear without a trace? For years, there were no clues, just speculation, manhunts, and a spot on Australia's most wanted list that stayed cold for 4 long decades. Then, thousands of miles away, a body showed up in a Texas morgue. And just like that, the silence began to crack. 2 weeks before the murders, something strange happened. Something that wouldn't raise alarms at the time, but would take on a chilling meaning later. Elmer Crawford and his wife Therese, who was pregnant with their 4th child, quietly drafted new wills. To Elmer, his family wasn't just in the way, they were liabilities. The kind of legal paperwork couples sort out when planning for the future. Except in these wills, everything, every single dollar, would go to Elmer, but only if Therese and the children were no longer alive. This was a normal-looking, apparently happy nuclear family. Therese Crawford was a devoted mother of 3, with another baby on the way. Her days were spent wrangling restless kids, folding laundry, and writing long letters to her sister Vonnie in Queensland. 12-year-old Catherine loved helping in the kitchen. James, just 8, was obsessed with trains, and little Karen, only 6, had a smile that made neighbors wave from their porches. And then there was Elmer Crawford, who had emigrated from Ireland in 1951 and worked at Victoria Racing Club in Melbourne. No one knew the darkness that resided in his heart. Back in the year 1970, Cardinal Road in Glenroy was like any other quiet suburban street. Red-tiled roofs, tidy lawns, and families winding down after long days. But right at the northern end sat something a little different. The Salvation Army Citadel. Today, it's a massive brick building spanning 2 suburban blocks. But back then, it was smaller, built from timber and painted a crisp, striking white. It may have looked modest, but it still stood out, just like it did the night everything changed. The Citadel wasn't just a place of worship, it brought the community together. Music was a big part of its soul, and every Wednesday night, locals would gather for choir practice, what the Salvation Army called the songsters. On warm summer evenings, the sound of harmonies floating through the streets often drew curious neighbors out for a listen. But Wednesday, July 1st, 1970, wasn't one of those tranquil nights. It was midwinter, cold, dark, and still. Around 7:30 p.m., Malcolm Thompson, a regular at choir practice, pulled up in front of the Citadel. As he made his way toward the entrance, he noticed something strange. The Crawfords' car, an older FB Holden, was parked unusually close to the footpath, right by the front gate. Odd, he thought. He knew the family well and had never seen their car sitting there like that. Minutes later, Thompson stepped back out for a quick errand and saw the car had been moved. It was now reversed down the driveway, The trunk nudged right up against the garage doors. A subtle change, but in hindsight, a chilling one. By the time he returned, choir practice was in full swing. The sound of voices filled the building, muffled by the thick walls. Outside, the night remained quiet, eerily so. Next door, inside the Crawford house, things seemed calm. After a long day of housework and caring for 3 restless kids, Therese Crawford was finally taking a moment for herself. Karen, the youngest, had been battling a nasty toothache, keeping everyone up the night before. But now the children were tucked into bed, dinner was over, and the house had settled into a deep silence. Therese slipped on her favorite vinyl Jiffy slippers and sank into a chair near the briquette fireplace, warming her tired body. She picked up a pen and began a letter to her sister Vonnie, who lived 1,000 miles away in Queensland. The two were close, and with phone calls expensive and visits rare. Letters were how they stayed connected. She had only written a few lines when she heard the back door open, then the familiar sound of Elmer's footsteps coming down the hallway. She didn't look up, didn't think anything of it. She figured he'd come in from tinkering in the garage, but then she felt his presence behind her. As she turned to greet him, Elmer raised a thick rubber hose, its end weighted with lead, and brought it down hard on her head. There was no scream, just a groan. Therese slumped over, unconscious. Elmer grabbed her arms and dragged her out of the living room. Her slippers slipped off near the chair as he hauled her body toward the master bedroom. He laid her out on the bed, still breathing, but barely. Then, without hesitation, he pulled out 2 strange-looking devices from his pocket. Electrical cables, each with a plug on one end and an alligator clip on the other. One clip went to her earlobe, the other to the soft skin between her thumb and index finger. He plugged the cords into the wall and flipped the switch. The electricity surged through her body. Instant death. The clips left burn marks that followed the current down her neck and arm. Elmer had prepared for this. Earlier, he had tampered with the fuse box, swapping out standard fuse wire with regular electrical cable. That way, the current wouldn't short out. The power would stay on, just long enough for him to finish what he started. Therese was gone, and with her, the child growing inside her, 3 months along. Once she was no more, Elmer calmly unplugged the cords, walked out of the room, turned right, then left, into the bedroom where his daughters, Catherine and Karen, were sleeping. A soft nightlight glowed in the hallway. Everything was quiet, but horror was just beginning. Inside the dimly lit bedroom, Elmer moved toward the bed of his eldest daughter. 12-year-old Catherine lay curled on her left side, fast asleep, unaware of the shadow looming over her. Without hesitation, Elmer raised a hammer high over his head and brought it crashing down on the right side of her skull. Elmer didn't stop. He raised the hammer again and drove it into the center of her forehead, splitting her skull a second time. After that, there was no more movement, just the slow, steady departure of life from an innocent body. Still, Elmer wasn't convinced she was gone. He reached into his pocket for another one of his crude devices, 2 wires with a plug at one end and clips at the other. Just like he'd done to her mother, he did the same to his daughter. Back at the Citadel, just before 8 p.m., the choir practice paused for a short tea break. Salvation Army soldier Leslie Atherton stood chatting with Malcolm Thompson when he paused. "It sounds like there's a bit of a fuss going on next door," he said, puzzled. From where they stood, only a few feet away from the Crawford house, they could hear strange thudding noises, like a pick or shovel hitting concrete. It didn't make sense. The Crawfords were usually so quiet. They strained to listen, but the sounds faded into the cold night air. Inside, Elmer moved to the opposite side of the bedroom, where 6-year-old Karen lay sleeping. Somehow, she hadn't stirred through the chaos. Maybe it was the toothache that had left her exhausted after 2 restless nights. Maybe it was just the deep sleep of a child who felt safe in her own home. But safety was gone. He raised the hammer once more and brought it down hard on Karen's forehead. The second blow left a deep wound that ended her suffering. She didn't even move. Elmer didn't bother with the wires this time. But in the third bedroom, something stirred. 8-year-old James had woken. Half asleep and disoriented, he wandered into the hallway. Maybe it was a sound. Maybe it was just a feeling. He walked past his sister's room, never noticing the blood, never seeing his father crouched over Catherine's body, wiping his hands on the blood-soaked sheets. Elmer had just begun wrapping the girls' bodies in blankets when he spotted James in the hallway. Hammer in hand, he moved fast. James had barely stepped into the master bedroom when Elmer struck. One brutal hit to the side of the boy's head sent him collapsing to the floor beside the bed. Then, like he'd done before, Elmer ripped the electric leads from Teresa's body and clamped them onto his son, just to be sure. James never stood a chance. The house reeked of death. There was no panic in him, just the cold, methodical calm of a man finishing a job. Elmer walked back to the girls' room and finished wrapping their bloodied bodies in sheets and blankets. The room was a nightmare. Then he returned to the master bedroom, did the same with Teresa and James, each one bundled tight. Dragging their bodies one by one, he left a trail of blood across the house. Down the hallway, through the kitchen, past the laundry, then out the back door, across the concrete pavement, and into the garage. Back at the Citadel, the choir break had ended. But Thompson and Atherton were still uneasy. Just before the music started again, they heard something else. Another strange sound. This time, it was unmistakable, the slow, scraping drag of something heavy being pulled across the ground. They didn't know it yet, but they were listening to Elmer Crawford disposing of his family. In the garage, Elmer had already prepared the car. The back seat was gone, removed earlier and leaning against the garage wall. He opened the door and one by one placed the bodies inside the empty space. He layered more blankets on top, followed by a heavy canvas tarp. Then, on top of it all, he stacked plastic containers filled with gasoline. The motor scooter went into the trunk. Everything had been planned. The next step was to make sure they were never found. Investigators later believed that Teresa's mental health and the stress of another child on the way may have pushed Elmer to a breaking point. But there was nothing that could justify a brutal murder of a whole family. Some also suspected another motive, a quieter one. Elmer had allegedly been stealing from his workplace. Maybe he was afraid of being caught. Maybe he thought the walls were closing in. Whatever was going through his mind, one thing became clear. This was a man planning for a future without his family in it. A year after the murders, in July 1971, a coroner's inquest finally pieced together what had happened inside the Crawford home on Cardinal Road, Glenroy. What it revealed was more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. After the murders, Elmer didn't panic. He didn't run. He started cleaning up. One by one, he wrapped the bodies of Teresa, Catherine, James, and little Karen in blankets. Then, in the eerie calm of early morning, he carried them out of the house and loaded them into the family's Holden FE sedan. But it wasn't just the bodies he packed. Alongside them, He placed fuel cans, a motorbike, a rifle, and a rubber hose, each item carefully selected, as if this was all part of a twisted plan. The car's registration plate read HKU061. That number would later become burned into the memory of everyone who followed the case. Elmer then drove 200 long kilometers southwest through winding country roads, all the way to Port Campbell. It was a desolate, rocky stretch of coastline, where jagged cliffs dropped straight into the crashing sea. He knew the area well, and there, under the cover of night or early dawn, he staged his final act. He ran a hose from the car's exhaust pipe into the driver's side window, setting the scene for what would look like an attempt to end one's life along with the others. The idea was to make it appear as though Therese, pregnant, overwhelmed, had taken the children's lives and her own. But he didn't stop there. To make sure the car would actually roll off the edge, Elmer laid down a path of stones across a drainage ditch, carefully guiding the vehicle's path toward the cliff's drop. Then he pushed. Or at least, he tried to. The car didn't fall the way he planned. It landed awkwardly, snagged just before the edge, hanging above the sea like a half-finished secret. And that's where the tourists found it. A report was made immediately, and the officer's first thought was to check the car under stolen vehicles. But this was not supposed to be a slow, lengthy procedure. A long while after, investigators were involved, knocking on the doors of the family's Melbourne home in search of the father to give him the devastating news. Little did they know, the father had inflicted the suffering on his little family. Elmer Crawford was last seen in his driveway, the very same day his car was discovered near the cliff, packed with the bodies of his wife and children. After that, he vanished. No one saw him leave. No one knew where he went. It was as if he had simply stepped off the map. For decades, there were whispers. In 1994, an old acquaintance claimed to have spotted him in Western Australia, but nothing came of it. Just another lead that faded into thin air. By 2008, with still no answers and no sign of Elmer, authorities put up a reward. 100,000 Australian dollars for any information leading to his arrest. The public was hopeful. Maybe someone, somewhere, knew something. Then came a twist no one expected. In 2010, police in Victoria announced they were working with the FBI. A man had died in San Angelo, Texas, back in 2005. He had no fingerprints, multiple fake IDs, and a face that, according to facial recognition technology, was a possible match for Elmer Crawford. It felt like a breakthrough. Maybe the monster who had fled across the world had finally been found. But hopes were short-lived. On August 27, 2010, DNA testing from one of Crawford's living relatives came back. It was a definitive no. The man in Texas wasn't Elmer, and just like that, the trail went cold again. Still, the search didn't stop. After announcing the reward, Victorian police reported a flood of new tips and leads from the public, each one offering a possible glimpse into where Elmer Kyle Crawford might be hiding. Some said he was living under a new name. Others claimed to have seen someone who looked just like him, years or even decades after the murders. But no tip ever led to an arrest. No confirmed sightings, no smoking gun, just a name, a face, and a trail that kept disappearing into the shadows. Even after all these years, police haven't given up. It has been almost 50 years since the brutal murders inside that quiet Glenroy home. A mother, 3 children, all gone in a single night of unimaginable violence. And the man believed to be responsible, still missing. Detectives say the case remains open. Elmer Crawford is still wanted. The coronial inquest made in 1971 left no room for doubt. He killed his family, planned it down to the last detail, and vanished without a trace. The $100,000 reward still stands, unchanged since it was first offered over a decade ago. Authorities continue to urge anyone with information, no matter how small, to come forward. Because for police, and for the community that remembers, justice is long overdue. The Crawford family murders have continued to haunt not just investigators, but the public imagination. Over the years, the case has been revisited in books, television, and podcasts, each one trying to make sense of the horror Elmer left behind. In 2006, the crime was featured in an episode of Sensing Murder titled Almost Perfect. 5 years later, author Greg Fogarty, who once lived on the same street as the Crawfords, released a detailed account of the case in his book Almost Perfect, The True Story of the Crawford Family Murders. The story has also found its way into the true crime podcast world, covered in an episode of Felon, and again in episode 290th of the Case File podcast. But no matter how many times the story is told, one question still echoes louder than the rest. Where is Elmer Crawford? He planned the unthinkable and got away with it. For over 5 decades, he's evaded justice while the memory of his family's final moments lingers in the silence he left behind. Will the truth ever catch up to the man who vanished into the shadows? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you've made it this far, be sure to check out this next video. I think you'll enjoy it. Thank you once again for watching.